The mahogany walls of the Senate chamber seemed to absorb sound that morning, creating a peculiar acoustic deadness that made every cough, every shuffle of paper, feel intrusive. Hillary Rodham Clinton adjusted her microphone with practiced precision, her expression carefully calibrated to project confidence without arrogance, authority without condescension. She had mastered this balance over 4 decades in the public eye. She knew which cameras would focus on her profile, which angles the networks preferred, which expressions translated best to social media clips. Every detail had been rehearsed. The navy blue blazer, conservative enough for congressional testimony but expensive enough to remind everyone of her status. The minimal jewelry, just enough to soften the severity without appearing frivolous. Even the way she held her pen, ready to take notes she would never actually reference, conveyed engaged professionalism. But beneath the composed exterior, something hummed with electric anticipation. This was her moment. The Democrats had orchestrated this hearing specifically to give her a platform, a stage to remind the American public why she should have been president, why she remained the most formidable political mind of her generation. And her target sat 20 feet away, reviewing documents with maddening casualness. J.D. Vance hadn't looked at her since entering the chamber. Not once. As vice president, he presided over the Senate, and today he occupied the chair with an almost unsettling stillness. His pen moved across legal pads in steady strokes. His eyes scanned documents with the focus of someone reading grocery lists rather than preparing for political combat. The younger senators, both Democrat and Republican, kept glancing between him and Hillary, waiting for the fireworks everyone knew were coming. But Vance seemed oblivious, or perhaps indifferent, to the tension crackling through the room. Hillary recognized the tactic. She had used it herself countless times. Appear disinterested, refuse to acknowledge the opponent's importance, make them wonder if you're even paying attention. But something about Vance's particular brand of stillness unsettled her in a way she couldn't quite articulate. It wasn't nervousness. It wasn't the fidgeting of someone unprepared. It was the patience of a hunter who had already positioned himself perfectly, and now simply waited for the prey to step into the trap. She dismissed the thought. This was her arena. She had testified before Congress more times than most current senators had been in office. She had faced down hostile Republican committees during Benghazi, during the email investigation, during her husband's impeachment. She had survived all of it, more than survived. She had emerged with her political viability intact, her reputation as a fighter enhanced. And today would be no different. Today would be better. Today she would eviscerate this hillbilly upstart on national television. The lines were already prepared, workshopped with her team, tested with focus groups, refined until they cut with maximum efficiency. You've written about poverty, Mr. Vice President, but you've never actually solved it. You called your own running mate reprehensible. What does that make you? The contrast would be devastating. Experience versus inexperience. Substance versus opportunism. A lifetime of service versus a memoir and a Senate term. The clips would dominate cable news for days. The social media shares would be astronomical. She would remind everyone why they had underestimated her at their peril. Chairman Menendez gavelled the hearing to order, his voice carrying through the packed chamber with performative solemnity. Every seat was filled. Every camera was positioned. C-SPAN had cleared its schedule. The cable networks had gone live. This was the most anticipated congressional hearing since James Comey testified about Russian interference, and everyone understood why. The Democrats wanted their champion back on the national stage. They wanted her to destroy the vice president. They wanted blood. And Hillary Rodham Clinton was ready to give it to them. She leaned forward into her microphone, her voice carrying that particular timbre she had perfected over thousands of speeches, authoritative without being shrill, passionate without being emotional, the voice of someone who had earned the right to speak and expected to be heard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before this committee to discuss American leadership in an increasingly complex and dangerous world. But before I address the specific policy questions that have been raised, I feel compelled to address the broader context in which we find ourselves as a nation. She paused, letting the moment breathe exactly as her media coaches had taught her decades ago. The cameras would zoom in. The silence would create anticipation. The audience would lean forward. American leadership is not an accident. It's not a birthright. It's something that must be earned through experience, maintained through wisdom, and defended through the kind of judgment that only comes from decades of engagement with the most difficult challenges facing our country and our world. She could feel the rhythm of the speech taking hold, the familiar flow of argument and assertion that had carried her through so many battles. Her gaze drifted toward Vance, still absorbed in whatever documents lay before him on the presiding officer's desk. Time to draw first blood to force him to react, to crack that maddening composure. Unfortunately, we live in an era when experience is often dismissed as elitism, when expertise is derided as arrogance, when people with no meaningful understanding of the complexities of global affairs, no track record of actually accomplishing anything of substance, are nevertheless placed in positions of enormous responsibility simply because they tell a compelling personal story. Still, Vance didn't look up. His pen continued its steady movement across the page. His expression remained neutral, almost serene. Hillary felt a flicker of irritation sparking in her chest. He should be reacting by now. He should look defensive or angry or at least engaged. Any normal person would respond to such pointed criticism. But he simply sat there, methodical and calm, as if she were discussing the weather rather than questioning his qualifications for the second highest office in the land. She pressed forward, allowing her voice to sharpen just slightly, enough to signal displeasure without crossing into shrillness. I've spent 40 years in public service. I've negotiated with world leaders on every continent. I've sat across from Vladimir Putin and told him what America would and would not tolerate. I've managed crises that could have resulted in war. I've made decisions with imperfect information, knowing that lives hung in the balance, knowing that one wrong move could have catastrophic consequences for American security and American families. Now she turned directly toward him, abandoning the pretense of addressing the committee generally. This was personal. This was the moment. So I hope the vice president will forgive me if I'm somewhat skeptical when someone believes that writing a memoir about their difficult childhood qualifies them to be a heartbeat away from the presidency. That writing eloquently about poverty somehow substitutes for actually doing something about it. That giving speeches about the working class somehow compensates for never having held a position of real responsibility until voters made a mistake. A ripple moved through the chamber, gasps from some quarters, appreciative murmurs from the Democratic side. This was what everyone had come to witness. The full force of Hillary Clinton's intellect and experience weaponized against the vice president who had once called her opponent reprehensible and then joined his ticket anyway. This was the theater of political destruction, and she was the master performer. Finally, Vance looked up from his papers. His expression remained mild, almost pleasant, like a professor acknowledging a student's question during office hours. His voice, when he spoke, carried none of the defensiveness she had expected, none of the anger she had hoped to provoke. "Please continue, Mrs. Clinton. I'm listening." The calmness in his tone should have been her first warning, her only warning. But Hillary was committed now, carried forward by momentum and certainty, and 40 years of believing that she was smarter, more prepared, more formidable than any opponent who dared to challenge her. For the next 45 minutes, she delivered the performance she had rehearsed in front of mirrors and aides and sympathetic journalists. She lectured about the importance of experience in foreign policy, the dangers of populist movements that appealed to emotion rather than reason, the necessity of maintaining America's alliance network even when it seemed costly or complicated. Every point was an implicit or explicit criticism of Vance, of Trump, of everything they represented. She discussed her tenure as Secretary of State with the kind of detail that demonstrated mastery, dropping references to negotiations and summits, and crises that someone with only a Senate term couldn't possibly match. She painted herself as the steady hand, the experienced operator, the adult in the room who understood how the world actually worked rather than how simplistic narratives pretended it worked. Then she shifted to direct attacks, each one crafted for maximum viral potential, each one designed to make him look small while she appeared gracious and wise. "Mr. Vice President, I've read your book. Hillbilly Elegy. It's a moving personal story, I'll give you that. But I couldn't help noticing that your prescription for poverty was essentially to blame poor people for their circumstances. Personal responsibility, you called it. She shook her head with practiced disappointment, the expression she had used countless times when discussing Republican policies. That's a convenient philosophy for those who escaped poverty. It requires nothing from society, nothing from government, nothing from those who benefit from the system as it exists. It places all the burden on the people least equipped to bear it. She consulted her notes, though she had memorized every word. You wrote quite eloquently about the problems in your community, Mr. Vice President. The drug addiction, the family breakdown, the economic despair. Very moving, very sad, but here's my question. What have you actually done about it? You've been in the Senate. You're now Vice President. What policies have you championed to address these problems you wrote about so beautifully? What legislation bears your name? What programs have you created? Vance made a note on his legal pad. Nothing more. His face revealed nothing. Hillary felt her irritation growing but pushed it down. This was going exactly as planned. His silence would be interpreted as having no good answer. She pressed her advantage, pulling out a sheet of paper her staff had prepared, the compilation of contradictory statements about Trump that Vance had made in 2016. This was the kill shot, the moment that would define the hearing and destroy whatever credibility he had left. And then there's the rather remarkable evolution of your political principles, Mr. Vice President. I remember 2016 quite well. I was somewhat involved in that election, as you may recall. She paused for the laughter from the Democratic side, and I remember quite vividly some of the things you said about Donald Trump during that campaign. She read from the paper slowly, letting each quote land with maximum impact. You called him America's Hitler. Those were your words, not mine. America's Hitler. You said he was noxious and reprehensible. You said he was leading the white working class to a very dark place. You suggested he might be America's demise. She looked up, her expression a perfect blend of confusion and concern. These are strong words, Mr. Vice President. Principled words. The kind of words that suggest genuine moral conviction. She spread her hands in a gesture of bewilderment that had taken years to perfect. And yet here you are, just 4 years later, serving as his vice president, defending everything you once condemned, supporting policies you once opposed, standing beside a man you once compared to Adolf Hitler. She leaned forward slightly, narrowing her eyes just enough to signal that this was the important question. What happened, Mr. Vice President? Did you have a genuine change of heart? Did you see something in Donald Trump that you missed before? Or did you simply decide that principles were less important than power? That consistency was less valuable than a position on a presidential ticket. She let the question hang in the air for 3 full seconds, a pause that would play perfectly on television. Because from where I'm sitting, and I suspect from where most Americans are sitting, it looks very much like the latter. It looks like you said whatever was politically expedient at the moment. It looks like you attacked Trump when attacking him seemed advantageous, and then you joined him when joining him provided a path to power. She shook her head slowly, sadly. That's not leadership, Mr. Vice President. That's opportunism. And the American people deserve better than opportunists in positions of great responsibility. Vance continued taking notes, his pen moving at the same steady pace. He could have been transcribing her words or writing a grocery list. His expression revealed nothing. His body language showed no tension, and his silence was becoming genuinely unnerving. Why wasn't he defending himself? Why wasn't he interrupting with objections? Why wasn't he showing any of the defensive anger that should accompany such pointed attacks? But she was too far in to stop now, too committed to the performance she had planned. She pressed on, attacking his views on Ukraine, calling them dangerous isolationism. She criticized his skepticism about NATO, labeling it naive and ignorant of history. She questioned his understanding of China, suggesting that someone who had spent his formative years in rural Ohio couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of great power competition. She painted him as fundamentally unqualified, a man elevated beyond his competence by populist anger and political calculation. Mr. Vice President, she said, building to her conclusion, I don't question your intelligence. You clearly have that. I don't question your ambition. That's obvious to everyone. But intelligence and ambition are not the same as wisdom and judgment. They're not the same as experience. You've never managed a real crisis, not one where lives hung in the balance. You've never negotiated with a foreign adversary, never made a split-second decision knowing that getting it wrong could mean American deaths. She gestured around the chamber with the authority of someone who believed she had earned the right to judge, the right to lecture, the right to dismiss. I have done those things. For 40 years, I have done those things. And that's the fundamental difference between us, Mr. Vice President. That's why your presence in the office you hold is so deeply troubling to those of us who understand what's actually at stake in the world, who understand that foreign policy isn't about slogans and simple solutions. It's about hard choices and imperfect options, and living with the consequences of your decisions. She sat back in her chair, allowing herself a small, satisfied smile, the kind that signaled she had made her points and expected no adequate response. I hope you'll take these concerns in the spirit they're offered, Mr. Vice President. As honest counsel from someone who has been where you are, who has carried these responsibilities, who understands the weight of the office in a way that only comes from experience. The world is watching. American allies are watching. American adversaries are watching. I hope you're ready for that responsibility, because from what I've seen, I'm not sure you are. The applause came from the Democratic side of the chamber, sustained and enthusiastic. Senator Warren was practically beaming. Senator Booker nodded vigorously, clearly pleased with the performance. The media gallery typed furiously, already composing the headlines. Clinton eviscerates Vance on experience. Former Secretary of State destroys VP in hearing. The reckoning. She could see it all playing out exactly as planned. The cable news coverage, the social media shares, the revival of her status as the Democrat who could take on and demolish rising Republican stars. She folded her hands on the table with the satisfied air of someone who had accomplished exactly what they set out to do. The hard part was over. Now came the pleasant task of watching Vance try and fail to respond adequately. At the presiding officer's chair, J.D. Vance set down his pen with deliberate care. He aligned it perfectly parallel to the edge of his legal pad, a small gesture that somehow commanded attention. "Are you finished, Mrs. Clinton?" His voice remained conversational, almost gentle, without a trace of the defensiveness or anger she had been trying to provoke. Hillary's smile was gracious, magnanimous in what she believed to be victory. "I believe I've made my points, Mr. Vice President." "You have," Vance agreed, standing slowly. "Very thoroughly." He gathered several folders from beside him, thick manila folders that looked well used, their contents clearly organized with colored tabs visible along the edges. "And I appreciate your candor, your willingness to speak so directly about your concerns, your criticisms, your judgments about my qualifications and character." He walked to the front of the dais, descending the 3 steps with measured precision, never taking his eyes off her. "It makes what I'm about to do much easier." Something in his tone made Hillary's smile falter. It wasn't anger. It wasn't defensiveness. It was something else entirely, something calm and deliberate and utterly devoid of the fear or uncertainty she had expected to provoke. For the first time since the hearing began, she felt a cold finger of doubt trace down her spine. Vance set the folders on the desk in front of him with careful ceremony, arranging them in a specific order that suggested preparation and purpose. "You've raised questions about my experience, my qualifications, my judgment, my integrity. You've suggested that I'm unready for the responsibilities of high office, that I don't understand the weight of decisions that affect American lives." His voice remained measured, but something in it had changed, sharpened. "So let's talk about those things. Let's talk about experience. Let's talk about judgment. Let's talk about decisions that affect American lives." He opened the first folder, revealing what appeared to be official documents, their government seals visible even from where Hillary sat. "Let's talk about Benghazi." The single word dropped into the chamber like a stone into still water, and suddenly the entire acoustic quality of the room changed. The typing in the media gallery ceased. The murmurs from the senatorial desks died away. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Complete, utter, suffocating silence descended. Hillary felt her spine stiffen involuntarily. She had known Benghazi might come up. Of course it might. Republicans had been beating that drum for years, investigating it endlessly, trying and failing to find the smoking gun they were convinced existed. She had prepared responses, the same responses she had given to 9 congressional committees, 33 congressional hearings, countless media interviews. She knew how to handle Benghazi questions. She knew how to deflect, how to reframe, how to make the questioner look partisan and obsessed while she appeared patient and reasonable. But something about the way Vance was opening that folder, the methodical care with which he was arranging documents on the desk before him, made her stomach tighten with an apprehension she couldn't quite name. He wasn't grandstanding. He wasn't playing to the cameras. He was preparing, with the systematic precision of a surgeon laying out instruments for a complex operation. September 11, 2012, Vance began, his voice taking on a narrative quality, as if he were telling a story everyone needed to hear from the beginning. The American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya, was attacked by armed militants. 4 Americans died that night. Ambassador Chris Stevens, Information Officer Sean Smith, and CIA contractors Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty. They were the first American ambassador killed in the line of duty since 1979. He held up a document, angling it so the cameras could capture it clearly. The official State Department seal was visible at the top. In the months before that attack, the State Department, your State Department, Mrs. Clinton, received approximately 600 security requests from personnel in Libya. 600. The security situation was deteriorating rapidly. Militia groups were gaining power. The transitional government had no real authority. Ambassador Stevens himself sent multiple cables to Washington warning about the danger, requesting additional security personnel, additional protective measures. Vance looked up from the document, his eyes meeting Hillary's directly for what felt like the first time all morning. How many of those 600 requests were approved, Mrs. Clinton? Hillary leaned forward into her microphone, her voice taking on the measured, patient tone she had used countless times when explaining complex security decisions to people she considered too unsophisticated to understand them. Security decisions were made by security professionals within the department based on their assessment of risk, available resources, and competing priorities across multiple regions and facilities. These are complex determinations that involve multiple factors and cannot be reduced to simple metrics. That's not what I asked. Vance's voice cut through her response with surgical precision, not raised, not angry, but absolutely firm. I asked how many of the 600 security requests from Libya were approved. Do you know the answer to that question? Hillary opened her mouth, then closed it. The deflection she had offered, the standard response she had given dozens of times before, suddenly felt inadequate in the face of that simple, direct question. "I'll help you," Vance said quietly. Very few. The vast majority were denied. Some of them, he held up several cables, pulling them from the folder one by one, bear your signature. Others bear the signature of officials who reported directly to you. He set the cables down on the desk with deliberate care, spreading them out like a dealer laying out cards. Ambassador Stevens requested additional security personnel. Denied. He requested extended stays for security teams that were scheduled to rotate out. Denied. He requested hardened vehicle barriers for the compound. Denied. He sent a cable on the day he died, the very day, expressing concern about the security situation. He held up the cable dated September 11, 2012. And then that night he died. Tyrone Woods died. Glenn Doherty died. Sean Smith died. 4 men, 600 security requests, and your department said no. Hillary tried to respond, her media training kicking in automatically. The security situation in Libya was extraordinarily complex. The Accountability Review Board examined all of these decisions and found that. "Let's talk about the night of the attack," Vance interrupted, and Hillary felt a flash of genuine anger at being cut off, at having her carefully prepared response dismissed before she could deliver it. He pulled another document from the folder, this one appearing to be an email chain with timestamps clearly visible. The assault on the compound began at approximately 9:40 p.m. local time, 3:40 p.m. Washington time. By 4:05 p.m. Washington time, Just 25 minutes later, the State Department Operations Center had confirmed that the facility was under armed attack and had informed senior officials, including the White House Situation Room. He held up an email, zooming in on the header so the projection screen behind him could display it clearly for everyone in the chamber and everyone watching at home. At 10:12 p.m. Washington time, you sent an email to your daughter, Chelsea. He looked directly at Hillary. The email said, and I quote exactly, "Two of our officers were killed in Benghazi by an al-Qaeda-like group." Vance set down the email very carefully as if it were something fragile and precious. Al-Qaeda-like group. Those were your words, Mrs. Clinton, not mine, not some partisan investigator. Your words written to your daughter hours after the attack began. You knew that night, within hours of the attack, that it was terrorism. You knew it was an al-Qaeda-like group. You knew it was a planned, organized assault by militants. You knew it was not a protest. You knew it was not a spontaneous demonstration. You knew it had nothing to do with a YouTube video. He picked up another document. And yet the next day, and for weeks afterward, you and other administration officials told the American people something very different. You said the attack grew out of a spontaneous protest over an anti-Islamic video. You said there was no evidence of a planned terrorist assault. You blamed a filmmaker, a nobody making terrible videos in California, for an al-Qaeda attack in Libya. Vance pulled out a photograph, and Hillary's stomach dropped because she knew exactly what it was before he even spoke. On September 14, 2012, 3 days after the attack, you stood at Andrews Air Force Base as the bodies of the 4 Americans were brought home in flag-draped coffins. You spoke to the assembled crowd. You spoke to the media. And most importantly, you spoke privately to the families of the dead. His voice grew harder, each word landing with increased weight. According to multiple family members, stated publicly and under oath, you told them that you would make sure the person responsible for that video was arrested and prosecuted. You told them their sons died because of a filmmaker. He looked directly at her, and in that moment Hillary understood that she had walked into something far worse than she had imagined. Patricia Smith, Sean Smith's mother, has stated repeatedly, publicly and consistently for 12 years that you told her the video was responsible, that you promised to prosecute the filmmaker. Charles Woods, Tyrone Woods' father, kept detailed notes of his conversation with you. He says you told him the same thing. His notes, written that day, specifically mention your promise regarding the video maker. Vance leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping but somehow carrying even more forcefully through the silent chamber. You knew it was al-Qaeda. You wrote that to your daughter the night of the attack. You knew the video had nothing to do with it. And then you looked grieving mothers and fathers in the eye, while their sons lay dead in coffins behind you, and you lied to them. You blamed a filmmaker. You let them believe their sons died because of some nobody's YouTube video when you knew, absolutely knew, that it was a planned terrorist attack. He paused, and the silence in the chamber was so complete that somewhere in the back someone's phone vibrated audibly against a wooden desk. Why did you lie to them, Mrs. Clinton? Why did you stand there at Andrews Air Force Base, with American heroes dead behind you, and lie to their families about why they died? Hillary's face had gone pale, the carefully applied makeup suddenly unable to conceal the blood draining from her features. Her hands, usually so steady and controlled, trembled slightly as she reached for her water glass. She took a sip, buying time, trying to formulate a response that wouldn't make things worse. The intelligence was still being assessed at that time. There were multiple streams of information coming in. The situation was fluid and evolving. We were receiving reports about protests at other facilities that were connected to the video. And you told your daughter it was al-Qaeda the night it happened. Vance's voice was relentless now, not loud but unyielding. What intelligence were you still assessing? You already knew. You knew it was terrorism. You knew it was al-Qaeda. You wrote it to Chelsea. And then you lied to the families of the dead. You lied to the American people. You stood at the State Department days later and talked about the video. You appeared in television ads in Pakistan apologizing for the video, all while knowing it had nothing to do with the attack. He gathered the Benghazi documents, the cables, the emails, the photographs, and set them aside in a neat stack. 4 Americans died on your watch, Mrs. Clinton, because your department denied their requests for security. And then you lied about why they died. You lied to their families while standing next to their coffins. You lied to Patricia Smith, who just wanted to know why her son was dead. You lied to Charles Woods, who was trying to understand how his son's death had meaning. You looked them in the eye and lied. Vance's voice dropped lower, more intense, carrying an undercurrent of genuine anger now. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's your judgment. That's your record of making decisions that affect American lives. 4 dead Americans. 600 ignored security requests, and lies told to grieving families. He set down the Benghazi folder with a finality that seemed to echo through the chamber like a door slamming shut on any possible defense. Then, with the same methodical care, he reached for the next folder. The tab on this one read Private Email Server. Now, Vance said, his voice returning to that earlier conversational tone that was somehow more terrifying than anger. Let's talk about your emails. Hillary had expected Benghazi. Every Republican investigation for a decade had started with Benghazi. She had weathered it before, survived multiple congressional hearings, endless news cycles, years of attacks. She had her responses down. She knew how to handle it. But she could feel that this confrontation was different in a fundamental way that made her earlier confidence seem like foolish arrogance. Vance wasn't attacking. He was documenting. He wasn't making accusations. He was presenting evidence. He wasn't trying to score political points. He was systematically, methodically, clinically destroying her with her own record. When you became Secretary of State in January 2009, Vance began, opening the new folder with the same careful precision he had shown with the first. You made an unusual decision. Instead of using the State Department's secure email system, the system specifically designed and maintained to protect classified information, you chose to set up a private email server. He held up a photograph that appeared on the projection screen. It showed a suburban house, clearly identifiable as the Clintons' residence in Chappaqua. This server, he continued, maintained by a small private company called Platte River Networks, without the security protocols, without the oversight, without the protections required for government communications handling classified information, was installed in the basement of your home. He let that image linger on the screen. In your basement. In Chappaqua, New York. For 4 years, all of your official State Department correspondence, tens of thousands of emails, years of American diplomacy, communications with foreign officials, discussions of policy, negotiations, everything, went through a server in your basement. Hillary shook her head, reaching automatically for her prepared defense, the explanation she had given countless times. This has been extensively investigated. The FBI examined it. Multiple congressional committees examined it. There has been no finding of. It has been investigated, Vance agreed, pulling out a thick report with the FBI seal clearly visible. Let me tell you exactly what those investigations found. FBI Director James Comey, your own party's FBI director, appointed by President Obama, stated in his official findings that 110 emails on your private server contained classified information at the time they were sent or received. He let that number hang in the air. 110 emails containing classified information, not retroactively classified, as you've repeatedly claimed, classified at the time. Information that was born classified because of its content and sensitivity. Vance turned pages in the report, his finger tracing lines as he read. Of those 110 emails, 8 email chains contained information classified at the top secret level. Top secret, Mrs. Clinton. The highest level of classification. Information that, if compromised, could reasonably be expected to cause exceptionally grave damage to national security. He looked up, his eyes boring into hers. On an unsecured server. In your basement. Accessible to anyone with sufficient technical skill and motivation. Protected by a small IT company that had no experience handling classified government information. He paused, letting the weight of those facts settle over the chamber like a suffocating blanket. Director Comey described your handling of classified information as, and these are his exact words, not mine, not a political opponent's characterization. The FBI director's exact words: extremely careless. Hillary tried to interject, her voice taking on a defensive edge she immediately regretted. Director Kamai also concluded that no reasonable prosecutor would bring charges, which indicates. That's true, Vance nodded. But do you know why, Mrs. Clinton? He pulled out additional documents, more pages from the FBI report. Because proving criminal intent in these cases is exceptionally difficult. Because the standard for prosecuting a former cabinet official, especially one married to a former president, is different than the standard for prosecuting an ordinary government employee. Because political considerations, though everyone denied them, inevitably affected the decision. He set down the report and looked at her with an expression that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. But let's be absolutely clear about what you did, regardless of whether you were prosecuted for it. You took classified information, including top-secret information about some of the most sensitive matters affecting American national security, and you stored it on an unsecured private server because it was more convenient for you. Vance's voice hardened. If any person currently working in my office did what you did, they would lose their security clearance immediately. That day, they would be fired. They would likely be prosecuted. They might well be in prison. The standard government employees are held to is absolute. Mishandling classified information, even accidentally, even without malicious intent, ends careers and results in prosecution. He pulled out another document, this one appearing to be a timeline. But you're not an ordinary government employee, are you, Mrs. Clinton? You're a Clinton, and that means different rules apply. Hillary's throat had gone dry. She took another sip of water, trying to steady herself. And then Vance continued, his voice taking on an even harder edge. There's what happened when you got caught. In March 2015, the House Select Committee on Benghazi issued a subpoena. He held up the legal document, its official seal clearly visible. This subpoena required you to preserve and produce all emails related to Libya and the attack in Benghazi. He set down the subpoena with exaggerated care. A subpoena, Mrs. Clinton. A legal order from the United States Congress requiring you to preserve evidence. You're a lawyer. You know what a subpoena means. You know that destroying evidence after receiving a subpoena is obstruction of justice. You know it's a federal crime. You know people go to prison for it. Vance pulled out a technical report. Instead of complying with the subpoena, approximately 33,000 emails were deleted from your server. Not just deleted, wiped. Your staff used a program called BleachBit, software specifically designed to ensure files cannot be recovered, even with sophisticated forensic tools. BleachBit doesn't just delete files. It overwrites them multiple times to make sure they're gone forever. He held up photographs. Mobile devices that had contained your emails, BlackBerry devices issued to your staff, were physically destroyed. According to the FBI report, some were smashed with hammers. Vance looked up, his expression a mixture of disbelief and cold fury. 33,000 emails, subpoenaed by Congress, destroyed with BleachBit, devices smashed with hammers. And when you were asked about it, when a reporter asked if you had wiped the server, you said, and I quote, "What, like with a cloth or something?" And then you laughed. He set down the technical report. 33,000 emails subpoenaed by Congress, ordered to be preserved, and you destroyed them. You used software designed to make them unrecoverable. You smashed devices with hammers. And when asked about it, you laughed. You treated obstruction of justice like a joke. The chamber remained silent, but it was a different quality of silence now. The Democratic senators who had been enthusiastically applauding Hillary's opening attacks were staring at their desks. No one was taking notes. No one was typing. They were simply sitting in the mounting weight of documentation that kept coming, folder after folder, document after document, damning detail after damning detail. Vance gathered the email documents into a neat stack. You lectured me earlier about judgment, about qualifications, about fitness for office. You questioned whether I understand the weight of responsibility. But you compromised classified information, including top-secret information that could gravely damage national security. You stored it on an unsecured server because it was more convenient for you. And then, when Congress issued a subpoena, you destroyed the evidence. He looked directly at her. You treated national security like an inconvenience. You treated the rule of law like a joke, and you've never faced any meaningful consequences for any of it. He set aside the email folder and reached for the next one, even thicker than the previous two. This tab read Clinton Foundation. Why do you think that is, Mrs. Clinton? Vance asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Why do you think ordinary Americans, low-level government employees, people with no power and no connections, go to prison for mishandling classified information, but you walk free? Could it be, he suggested, his tone making it clear this was not actually a question, that there's one set of rules for the Clintons and another set of rules for everyone else? He opened the Clinton Foundation folder. Let's talk about how you became wealthy from a lifetime of public service. Let's talk about how dead broke, as you once claimed, became a net worth of over $100 million. Let's talk about the family charity. If you've been watching this detailed examination and want to see how this confrontation reaches its devastating conclusion, if you want to witness the complete exposure of 4 decades of carefully constructed narratives collapsing under the weight of documented evidence, make sure you subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. These are the political reckonings that reshape how we understand power and accountability. The establishment doesn't want these stories told with full documentation. Don't miss what happens next. Hillary Clinton had spent decades building protective walls around her scandals, constructing elaborate defenses of lawyers and strategists and friendly media and loyal surrogates who would attack anyone who questioned the official narrative. She had survived Whitewater, Travelgate, the Rose law firm billing records, her husband's impeachment, the Mark Rich pardon, the Senate campaign irregularities, the State Department controversies. Every time she had emerged damaged but intact, bloodied but standing, convinced that she was simply too important, too powerful, too necessary to be truly held accountable. But Vance wasn't attacking her walls. He was methodically showing what lay behind them, using her own documents, her own emails, her own foundation's financial records. The Clinton Foundation, Vance began, spreading financial disclosure forms across the desk before him, a charitable organization established by your husband after his presidency in 2001, officially dedicated to improving global health, strengthening economies, promoting healthier childhoods, fighting climate change. He looked up, a noble mission. And over the years, the foundation has done some genuinely good work. No one disputes that. He pulled out financial statements. Between 2001 and 2015, the Clinton Foundation raised approximately $2 billion. $2 billion from individuals, from corporations, from foreign governments, from some of the wealthiest and most powerful entities in the world. His voice took on a thoughtful quality, as if he were puzzling through something genuinely confusing. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a charitable foundation raising money from wealthy donors. That's how charitable foundations work. But the timing of some of these donations and the sources of some of these donations raise questions that have never been adequately answered. Vance spread documents across his desk in a careful arrangement that suggested hours of preparation. You became Secretary of State in January 2009. From that moment until you left office in February 2013, you were responsible for American foreign policy. You represented the United States in its relationships with every foreign government. You made recommendations about arms sales, trade agreements, diplomatic recognition, foreign aid. Every foreign government with interests that touched on American policy had to work with you. He held up a list, a long list with entries highlighted in yellow. And during your tenure as Secretary of State, the Clinton Foundation received tens of millions of dollars from those same foreign governments. Let's go through them, Vance said, his voice taking on the rhythm of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. Saudi Arabia donated between $10 and $25 million to the Clinton Foundation while you were Secretary of State. Saudi Arabia, a country where women couldn't drive, couldn't travel without male permission, couldn't obtain a passport without male consent. A country where homosexuality is punishable by death. A country where political dissidents are imprisoned, tortured, and murdered. They gave your family foundation up to $25 million while you were America's chief diplomat. He continued down the list. The United Arab Emirates 1 to 5 million, Kuwait 5 to 10 million, Qatar 1 to 5 million, Oman 1 to 5 million, all while you were Secretary of State, all while these countries had matters of great importance pending before your department. Vance set down the list and looked at Hillary, his expression a mixture of curiosity and condemnation. You lectured me earlier about women's rights. You called my positions, let me remember your exact words, prehistoric and dangerous to women. But you took tens of millions of dollars from governments that execute women for adultery, that stone women to death for being raped, that treat women as property, that deny women the most basic human rights. How do you reconcile that, Mrs. Clinton? How do you claim to be a champion of women while accepting money from regimes that brutalize women? Before she could formulate a response, he was already moving forward. And it wasn't just the foundation receiving money. Your husband's speaking fees increased dramatically during your time at state. Bill Clinton had been giving paid speeches since leaving office. That's normal for former presidents. But something interesting happened to his fees when you became Secretary of State. Vance held up a chart showing speaking fees over time. Before you became Secretary of State, Bill Clinton's average speaking fee was approximately $150,000. Substantial, but not unusual for a former president. During your tenure as Secretary of State, his average fee for speeches to certain types of entities jumped to over $500,000. He let that sink in. $500,000 per speech, but not for all speeches, only for speeches to entities that had business pending before the State Department, speeches to foreign governments, speeches to companies seeking State Department approval for various matters. Those speeches commanded premium rates. Vance pulled out specific examples. Bill Clinton received $500,000 from a Russian bank for a single speech in Moscow, while your State Department was reviewing whether to approve the sale of a company called Uranium One to the Russian government. He received $750,000 from a Swedish telecom company, while that company had significant regulatory business pending before your department. The pattern is clear, Vance said, his voice hardening. Before you became Secretary of State, Bill's speaking fees were substantial. During your tenure, they skyrocketed, but only for entities with interests before your department. When you left office, the fees dropped back to previous levels. He set down the chart. That's not coincidence, Mrs. Clinton. That's not market forces. That's a price structure. Access to the Secretary of State, influence with the person making decisions about foreign policy, cost $500,000 for a one-hour speech from her husband. Hillary's voice was tight, defensive, losing the authoritative quality she had carried into the hearing. My husband's speaking career has always been separate from my government service. They are completely independent. There is no connection between. Let's talk about Uranium One. Vance interrupted, pulling out an even thicker document, and Hillary felt her chest tighten because this was the scandal that had haunted her for years. The one her defenders could never quite explain away. The one that kept resurfacing no matter how many times it was supposedly debunked. In 2010, the Russian nuclear agency Rosatom sought to acquire a controlling stake in Uranium One, a Canadian company that controlled approximately 20% of America's uranium production capacity. He held up a map showing the locations of Uranium One's holdings across the United States. 20%. That's a significant portion of America's nuclear fuel supply. The sale required approval from multiple United States agencies, including the State Department, because it involved a strategic national security asset and a foreign government buyer. The Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which you sat on as Secretary of State, had to approve the transaction. Vance pulled out financial records, bank statements, donation receipts. During the period when this sale was being reviewed and approved, investors in Uranium One, people who stood to profit enormously from Russia's purchase of the company, donated approximately $145 million to the Clinton Foundation. He set the number out there and let it breathe. $145 million from people with a financial stake in a sale that your department had to approve. Vance pulled out more documents, and Bill Clinton received $500,000 for a speech in Moscow from a Russian bank with ties to the Kremlin, paid while this sale was pending, while your department was reviewing whether to approve Russia's acquisition of 20% of American uranium production. He leaned forward. The State Department approved the sale. Russia now controls 20% of American uranium production capacity, and the people involved in that transaction gave your foundation $145 million. His voice grew harder. You called me a puppet earlier. You suggested I'm controlled, that I do what I'm told by powerful interests. But you literally sold access to the State Department. You took millions from foreign governments while making decisions that affected them. You approved a sale that benefited Russia while Russians and people with Russian connections were writing massive checks to your foundation. Vance gathered the foundation documents. Who's the puppet, Mrs. Clinton? Who's been bought and paid for? Because from where I'm standing with these financial records in front of me, it looks like you sold American foreign policy to the highest bidder and called it charity. The Democratic senators looked stricken. This wasn't supposed to happen. Hillary was supposed to be destroying Vance, reminding everyone why she should have been president, demonstrating her superiority. Instead, she sat pale and silent while he systematically dismantled her with her own foundation's financial disclosure forms. Vance reached for another folder. This one's tab was particularly ominous: treatment of women. Now, he said quietly, let's talk about how you've actually treated women when it mattered. Hillary's expression hardened because she knew this would be personal, knew it would touch the most painful and complicated parts of her public life, the parts where her feminist rhetoric collided most dramatically with her actual conduct. Mrs. Clinton, you called me a misogynist during your opening statement. You suggested my positions on various issues are, quote, dangerous to women and set back decades of progress. You've built much of your public persona on being a champion of women, a feminist icon, a defender of those who have been victimized. He pulled out documents, statements, depositions. So let's examine how you've actually treated women, specifically the women who accused your husband of sexual misconduct. My husband is not on trial here. Hillary's voice cut through the chamber, but it lacked its earlier force. No, he's not, Vance agreed. You are. Because you weren't a passive bystander to his behavior. You weren't a victim, despite how you've sometimes portrayed yourself. You were an active, leading participant in the effort to silence and destroy the women who came forward. He held up the first document. Monica Lewinsky, a 22-year-old White House intern when she became involved with your husband, the President of the United States, the most powerful man in the world. According to multiple sources, including conversations that were recorded and later released, you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. Vance looked up. A young woman barely out of college, targeted by the president, their relationship exposed to the world, humiliated on a global stage. And you called her a narcissistic Looney Tune. You led the effort to paint her as the aggressor, as the problem, as the one who caused the scandal, when she was an intern and he was the President of the United States. He moved to the next document, Jennifer Flowers. She came forward during the 1992 campaign with evidence of a long-term affair with Bill Clinton, including recordings of phone conversations. Your campaign's response wasn't to address the allegations honestly. It was to destroy her, to dig up anything negative from her past, to paint her as a liar, as unstable, as someone whose word couldn't be trusted. Vance held up a deposition. Years later, under oath in a legal proceeding, your husband admitted the affair happened. Jennifer Flowers was telling the truth, but by then, her reputation had been destroyed. By then, the damage your team did to her was permanent. He continued methodically through the list. Paula Jones. She alleged that Bill Clinton sexually harassed her when he was governor of Arkansas, exposing himself to her in a hotel room and propositioning her for sex. Your team's response was the same playbook: attack, discredit, destroy. James Carville, your close ally, said about Paula Jones, drag a $100 bill through a trailer park, You never know what you'll find. Vance's voice was cold. That's how your team talked about a woman who accused your husband of sexual harassment. She was trailer trash. She was a gold digger. She was lying for attention. Except she wasn't lying. Your husband eventually settled the case, paid her $850,000, but Paula Jones's reputation had already been destroyed. Kathleen Willey, Vance continued, a White House volunteer who alleged that Bill Clinton groped her in the Oval Office when she came to ask for help with financial problems. After she came forward, strange things started happening to her. Her tires were mysteriously slashed. Her cat disappeared and was later found dead. A stranger approached her while she was jogging and asked about her children by name, mentioning how easy it would be for something to happen to them. He set down the documents. Kathleen Willey has said publicly, repeatedly, that she believes these incidents were intimidation orchestrated by people trying to silence her. Whether or not you can prove a direct connection, the pattern is clear. Women who accused your husband faced systematic campaigns of intimidation and character destruction. And then Vance said, his voice dropping to something just above a whisper, there's Juanita Broderick. The name hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be ignored or deflected. Juanita Broderick has alleged, consistently, publicly, for over 40 years, that Bill Clinton raped her in 1978 in a hotel room in Little Rock when he was Attorney General of Arkansas. She says he forced himself on her. She says he bit her lip so hard it bled and swelled. She says he told her afterward to put ice on it. Vance pulled out a statement, Broderick's own words typed on official paper. She also says that several weeks after the alleged assault, you approached her at a campaign event. She says you grabbed her hand, held it tightly, looked her directly in the eye and said, I just want you to know how much Bill and I appreciate everything you do for us. He looked up at Hillary. She says you squeezed her hand painfully. She says your look, your tone, your entire demeanor was a clear threat, a message that she should stay quiet about what your husband had done to her. Did you threaten Juanita Broderick, Mrs. Clinton? Did you approach a woman who alleged that your husband raped her and send her a message to keep her mouth shut? Silence, complete silence. That allegation has been investigated, Hillary began. I didn't ask if it was investigated, Vance cut her off. I asked if you did it. Did you approach Juanita Broderick at that event? Did you grab her hand? Did you tell her how much you and Bill appreciated everything she did? Did you make it clear that she should stay quiet about the rape? More silence. Hillary's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. You've built your entire public image on being a champion of women, Vance continued, gathering the documents about the accusers. You've said, believe women. You've spoken eloquently about the importance of supporting survivors of sexual assault. You've lectured others about their treatment of women. But when women accused your husband, you didn't believe them. You attacked them. You destroyed them. You hired private investigators, a term you're familiar with, Bimbo Eruption Squad. That was the internal name, wasn't it? You ran an organized campaign to dig up dirt, to threaten, to intimidate, to silence any woman who might damage your husband's career or your own political ambitions. Vance set aside the folder. That's not feminism, Mrs. Clinton. That's not supporting women. That's complicity in abuse. You enabled your husband's predatory behavior for decades. You helped destroy the women who tried to hold him accountable. And then you had the audacity, the sheer gall, to present yourself as a champion of women's rights. He looked directly at her. You called me a misogynist, but I've never attacked a rape victim. I've never hired private investigators to destroy women who accused someone of sexual harassment. I've never threatened a woman to keep her quiet about an assault. He paused. You have. And everyone watching knows it now. The chamber was suffocating in its silence. Hillary sat motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. The confident smirk, the superior air she had carried into the chamber that morning, was completely gone. In its place was something she rarely showed in public, something that made her suddenly look much older than her years. Raw, undisguised fear. Vance reached for his final major folder. The tab read simply, 2016. Let's talk about the election you lost, Vance said quietly. Hillary shifted in her seat. This was the wound that had never healed, the humiliation she had never processed, the loss that she couldn't accept even years later. In 2016, you ran for president against Donald Trump. Vance's voice took on an almost conversational quality, as if they were just two people discussing history. You had every advantage. More money, exponentially more staff, more endorsements from elected officials, from newspapers, from celebrities, from every establishment institution. More experience by any conventional measure. The media overwhelmingly favored you. The polls said you would win. Everyone said you would win. He pulled out documents, but you didn't win, you lost. And according to your own book, What Happened, published months after the election, you've never taken responsibility for that loss. Not really. Not in any meaningful way. Vance held up what appeared to be a list compiled from her book. In What Happened, you blamed Russia. You blamed FBI Director James Comey. You blamed Bernie Sanders for staying in the primary too long. You blamed the media for covering your emails too much and Trump's scandals too little. You blamed sexism. You blamed voter suppression. You blamed the Electoral College. You blamed fake news. You blamed WikiLeaks. You blamed the DNC for not being supportive enough. You blamed your own staff for various failures. You blamed what you called the vast right-wing conspiracy that's been targeting you for decades. He set down the list. You had an explanation for everything except your own failures, your own mistakes, your own shortcomings as a candidate. It was everyone else's fault, never yours. Let's start with how you talked about voters, Vance said, pulling out a transcript. On September 9, 2016, at a fundraiser in New York City surrounded by wealthy donors, you said this about Americans who supported Donald Trump. He read slowly, emphasizing each word. You know, to just be grossly generalistic, you could put half of Trump's supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. Right. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it. Vance looked up. You called tens of millions of Americans deplorables. You said they were racists. You said they were irredeemable, beyond hope, not worth trying to reach. And then you wondered why they didn't vote for you. His voice took on a personal edge for the first time. I grew up with those people, Mrs. Clinton, the people you called deplorables. They're my family. They're my neighbors from Middletown, Ohio. They're not racists. They're not irredeemable. They're Americans who work hard, who love their families, who go to church, who serve in the military, who just wanted someone in Washington to remember they exist. But you looked down on them with such obvious contempt. You dismissed their concerns. You treated them like problems to be managed rather than citizens to be represented. And you did it at a fancy Manhattan fundraiser surrounded by wealthy elites who laughed and applauded your contempt. Vance pulled out more documents, campaign schedules, and your contempt showed in your campaign strategy. You didn't visit Wisconsin once during the general election. Not once. Wisconsin, a state that had voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. You took it for granted. You assumed you didn't need to actually show up and ask for their votes. You lost Wisconsin by 23,000 votes. He continued. You barely visited Michigan. A handful of stops, mostly in Detroit, nothing in the rural areas, nothing in the communities that used to be manufacturing powerhouses before trade policies you supported shipped their jobs overseas. You lost Michigan by 11,000 votes. You took Pennsylvania for granted until it was too late. You finally showed up in the last week, but by then the damage was done. You lost it by 44,000 votes. Vance set down the documents. 3 states. Fewer than 80,000 votes combined. That's the margin that cost you the presidency. And you lost those votes because you were too arrogant to show up, too elitist to ask for them, too contemptuous to even pretend you cared about working-class voters in the Rust Belt. He pulled out one more document, and Hillary actually flinched. And then there's the Steele dossier. The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of recognition spreading through the chamber. During the 2016 campaign, your campaign and the Democratic National Committee paid over $1 million to a law firm called Perkins Coie. Perkins Coie hired a company called Fusion GPS. Fusion GPS hired a former British intelligence officer named Christopher Steele to compile opposition research on Donald Trump. That research became known as the Steele dossier. Vance held up the infamous document. It contained sensational allegations about Trump, allegations that would, if true, suggest he was compromised by Russia, allegations that dominated news coverage for months, allegations that have never been verified and many of which have been actively, definitively disproven. But here's what matters. Here's what we know now. Vance's voice was relentless. Your campaign paid for this. Your campaign paid for opposition research that was then used to obtain FISA warrants to surveil American citizens associated with the Trump campaign. It was leaked to media outlets before the election. It became the foundation of years of Russia collusion investigations. He pulled out an indictment. The primary subsource for the Steele dossier, a man named Igor Danchenko, was later charged by special counsel John Durham with lying to the FBI about where his information came from. The FBI knew early on that there were serious credibility problems with the dossier, and they used it anyway. The entire Russia collusion narrative that consumed American politics for 4 years was built on opposition research your campaign paid for. Vance set down the documents. You accused me of being Trump's puppet, of lacking principles, of saying whatever was convenient, but you paid for fake opposition research and watched as it was used to spy on American citizens, to undermine a presidential campaign, to delegitimize an election. You've spent years promoting a narrative that you helped create with paid political dirt. He looked at her steadily. That's not principle, Mrs. Clinton. That's propaganda, and you've never been held accountable for it. Vance walked to the front of the dais for his conclusion, standing just a few feet from the witness table where Hillary sat. The chamber was so quiet that his footsteps echoed with each deliberate step. Mrs. Clinton, you came here today to lecture me, to remind everyone why you should have been president, to prove you're still the most formidable figure in American politics, to destroy me. He paused, his eyes moving slowly across the chamber before settling back on her. So let's review your 40 years of experience. Let's see what Hillary Rodham Clinton's decades in public life have actually produced. He raised one finger. Benghazi. 4 Americans dead because your department denied their 600 security requests. You knew the night of the attack that it was an Al-Qaeda-like terrorist group. You wrote it to your daughter. And then you looked grieving parents in the eyes at Andrews Air Force Base and blamed a YouTube video. You lied to Patricia Smith while her son lay dead behind you. A second finger, the emails. You compromised classified information, including top-secret information, by storing it on an unsecured server in your basement because it was more convenient. When Congress subpoenaed those emails, you had them destroyed with BleachBit. You had devices smashed with hammers. Anyone else would be in prison. You laughed about it. A third finger, the foundation. You took tens of millions from foreign governments while you were Secretary of State. Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Oman, governments that execute women for being raped, that stone homosexuals to death, that torture dissidents. Your husband's speaking fees doubled when entities had business before your department. You sold access to American foreign policy. A fourth finger, the women. You presented yourself as a champion while destroying women who accused your husband. Monica Lewinsky was a narcissistic Looney Tune. Jennifer Flowers was a liar until your husband admitted it under oath. Paula Jones was trailer trash. Kathleen Willey was harassed until she was terrified. You allegedly threatened Juanita Broaddrick. A fifth finger, 2016. You called working-class Americans deplorables and irredeemables. You were too arrogant to campaign in Wisconsin. You paid for the Steele dossier that was used to spy on American citizens. And when you lost, you blamed everyone but yourself. Vance lowered his hand. That's your experience, Mrs. Clinton. That's 40 years in public life. Scandal after scandal, failure after failure, lie after lie, corruption after corruption, and never, not once, have you taken responsibility for any of it. He walked closer. You asked me what I know about foreign policy. I know enough not to get 4 Americans killed and lie about why. I know enough not to compromise classified information on a basement server. I know enough not to take money from governments that brutalize women. I know enough not to sell access to the highest bidder. His voice grew stronger. You asked about my qualifications. I'm qualified enough not to destroy evidence under subpoena. I'm qualified enough not to attack rape victims. I'm qualified enough not to call half the country deplorables. I'm qualified enough to admit when I'm wrong, something you've never done. He looked directly into her eyes. You called me inexperienced, but your experience is 40 years of scandal, corruption, and failure. That's not a qualification, Mrs. Clinton. That's a warning label. You called me a hypocrite for changing my views on Trump. I changed openly. I explained why. I didn't hide it. You've spent 40 years hiding evidence, destroying documents, attacking anyone who questioned you. You've built your entire career on deflection and deception. You called me a puppet, but you're the one who took millions from foreign governments. You're the one whose husband's fees depended on what your department was reviewing. You're the one who sold American foreign policy to the highest bidder. You called me a misogynist, but you're the one who destroyed women to protect your husband's career. You're the one who called a 22-year-old intern a Looney Tune. You're the one who allegedly threatened a rape victim. Vance straightened to his full height. You came here to destroy me, to prove you're still the most important political figure of your generation. He shook his head slowly. But all you've done is remind everyone why they didn't vote for you in 2016, why they don't trust you, why 40 years of Hillary Clinton has left a trail of scandals, lies, and failures that you've never been held accountable for. His voice dropped lower, more intense, until today. Today, finally, everyone gets to see the full record, not the carefully curated image, not the media-friendly version, not the spin, the truth, the documents, the emails, the financial records, the testimony, all of it laid out for the world to see. He returned to his seat at the presiding officer's chair. I yield my time, Mr. Chairman. Silence. Complete, absolute, overwhelming silence filled the chamber like water flooding a sinking ship. For perhaps the first time in her 40-year public career, Hillary Rodham Clinton had been comprehensively, systematically, devastatingly dismantled. Not through partisan attacks, not through speculation or conspiracy theories, but through her own documented record, presented with methodical precision and unanswerable evidence. She sat motionless at the witness table. The color had drained entirely from her face, leaving her complexion gray beneath the studio lights. Her hands lay flat on the table, trembling visibly in a way that would be captured by every camera in the room. Her staff leaned in, whispering urgently, but she didn't seem to hear them. She stared at nothing, her eyes unfocused, as if watching her entire legacy burn in real time and being powerless to stop it. In the gallery, Bill Clinton sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that muscles stood out along his neck. His face was flushed, a dangerous red that suggested barely controlled fury. He had watched many attacks on Hillary over the years. He had helped her survive them all, had spun and deflected and counterattacked with the skills that had made him one of the greatest political communicators of his generation. But this was different. This wasn't an attack that could be spun. This was an autopsy, a methodical dissection of 40 years of lies, conducted with surgical precision using their own documents. The Democratic senators who had orchestrated this hearing, who had been so eager to give Hillary a platform to destroy the vice president, were now studying their phones, their papers, their fingernails, anything except the witness table where their champion sat defeated. There was nothing they could say, no spin that could undo what had just happened. The documentation was real. The emails were real. The financial records were real. The testimony of the families was real. You couldn't spin away documented reality when it was displayed on screens for the entire nation to witness. Chairman Menendez attempted to restore some semblance of normalcy, his voice strained and uncertain. We'll take a 15-minute recess too. No, Hillary's voice was hoarse, barely recognizable, lacking any trace of the authority and confidence she had radiated just hours earlier. I have a response. The chamber went completely silent again. Every eye turned back to her. Cameras zoomed in. The world waited. She leaned into her microphone, her hands trembling visibly now, a sight no one had ever witnessed before. Hillary Clinton never trembled. Hillary Clinton was always composed, always controlled, always projecting strength even when she felt weak. Mr. Vice President, she began, and her voice cracked slightly. She cleared her throat. You've delivered quite a prosecution today. Very thorough, very well prepared. I can see why you attended Yale Law School. She attempted something that might have been a smile. It looked like a grimace. But everything you've said, these accusations have all been investigated before. I've faced these questions for decades. I've testified before Congress more times than I can count. I've been investigated by the FBI, by special prosecutors, by hostile committees. And I'm still here because Mrs. Clinton Vance's voice was quiet but utterly firm, cutting through her words like a scalpel through tissue. I didn't make accusations. I read documents, your emails, your foundation's financial records, your campaign's FEC filings, the FBI's official reports, congressional testimony, statements from the families of the dead. He held up the folders arrayed before him. These aren't accusations. They're your own words, your own actions, your own documented record. If you have an explanation for any of it, an actual explanation rather than a deflection, I'm listening. The entire chamber is listening. Hillary stared at him, her mouth opening and then closing. The thousands of hours of media training, the decades of hostile interviews, the countless congressional hearings, all of it failed her in that moment. She had no words. Vance's voice remained steady, implacable. Why did you tell your daughter it was Al-Qaeda the night of Benghazi, and then tell the American people it was a YouTube video? Silence. Why did you destroy 33,000 emails after they were subpoenaed by Congress? Silence. Why did the Clinton Foundation accept tens of millions from Saudi Arabia while you were Secretary of State? Silence. Why did your husband speaking fees double for entities with business before your department? Silence. Did you approach Juanita Broderick at that campaign event? If she's lying, why would you have done that? Silence. Vance set down the folders with finality. You've spent 40 years avoiding these questions, Mrs. Clinton, deflecting them, blaming your accusers, claiming it's all political, hiding behind lawyers and investigations that never quite reach conclusions. But you've never actually answered them. You've never explained the documents. You've never taken responsibility. He looked at her with something that might have been pity if it weren't so cold. And now everyone watching knows why. There are no good answers. There's only the record. And the record is damning. Hillary opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. She tried again. Nothing came out. The most practiced, most skilled public speaker of her generation, a woman who had given thousands of speeches and survived hundreds of hostile interviews, had been rendered completely, utterly speechless. After a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, she began gathering her papers. Slowly, mechanically, like someone moving underwater or through fog. Her staff moved to assist her, to help her rise from the chair that suddenly seemed too large for her diminished presence. The protective entourage that had swept into the chamber 3 hours ago with such confidence now formed a defensive perimeter, shielding her from cameras as she walked toward the exit. No one in the media gallery shouted questions. What was there to ask? The documents had spoken. The evidence had been presented. The record was clear. As she passed the dais, Vance was organizing his folders, speaking quietly with an aide about the afternoon schedule. He looked up as Hillary passed, their eyes meeting one final time across the chamber. "I'm sorry it had to be this way, Mrs. Clinton," he said quietly, just loudly enough for her and those immediately nearby to hear. "But you attacked me. You attacked my family. You attacked my background. You opened the door." He paused. "I just walked through it with the truth." Hillary said nothing. She kept walking, her face a carefully maintained mask, her staff forming a tight protective circle around her. She didn't stop, didn't pause, didn't look back until she was in her car, surrounded by tinted glass and physical distance from the cameras that had captured every moment of her humiliation. Only then, alone in the back seat as the vehicle pulled away from the Capitol, did she allow herself to fully comprehend what had happened. For 40 years she had believed she was untouchable, too powerful, too connected, too important. Every scandal had been weathered. Every investigation had been survived. Every accuser had been discredited or ignored. The machine she and Bill had built was supposed to protect them from everything, from everyone, forever. But the documents had always been there. The emails, The financial records, the cables from Benghazi, the testimony from the families, the statements from the women, the FBI reports. All of it had been there, scattered across different investigations, different hearings, different news cycles, waiting for someone willing to compile it, organize it, and present it without fear of the Clinton machine's wrath. J.D. Vance hadn't been afraid. He had prepared methodically, waited patiently, and struck devastatingly. He had done what 40 years of opponents had failed to do. He had held her accountable using nothing but her own documented record. And now her legacy, the carefully constructed narrative of Hillary Clinton as feminist icon, as foreign policy expert, as the most qualified candidate ever to run for president, lay in ruins. Not destroyed by partisan attacks or conspiracy theories, but exposed by her own documents, her own words, her own actions. Her phone began buzzing with messages. Dozens, then hundreds. She turned it off. She couldn't face it yet, couldn't face any of it, couldn't face what came next. The video went viral within the hour. 20 million views by midnight, 50 million by morning, 120 million views in the first 48 hours. The Reckoning, as media outlets quickly dubbed it, became the most-watched congressional hearing in American history, surpassing Watergate, surpassing Iran-Contra, surpassing every politically significant moment of the television age. Clips were shared across every platform. The moment Vance held up the email to Chelsea, the list of foreign donations to the Clinton Foundation, the names of the women Bill had assaulted and Hillary had destroyed, the confrontation about the destroyed emails. Each clip generated millions of views on its own, spreading across social media like wildfire, impossible to contain or control. Analysis pieces flooded every outlet. Conservative media celebrated the exposure of Clinton corruption they had been documenting for decades, vindicated finally by seeing it all presented in one devastating presentation. Liberal outlets scrambled desperately to defend Hillary, but their defenses sounded increasingly hollow when viewers could simply watch the hearing themselves and see the documents Vance had presented. The phrase 40 years of failure became a hashtag, a meme, shorthand for political corruption and elite impunity. Images of Hillary's face draining of color as Vance presented each new folder became iconic. The contrast between her confident, condescending attack at the beginning and her silent, defeated exit at the end was played on endless loops across every platform. The political fallout was swift and comprehensive. Within 48 hours, 3 major Democratic donors who had supported the Clintons for decades announced they were cutting ties. Within a week, that number had grown to 20. The Clinton Foundation, already diminished since 2016, saw its remaining donor base evaporate overnight. Board members resigned, citing vague scheduling conflicts and family commitments. Major partners announced they were ending their relationships with the organization. Within weeks, the foundation announced it was dramatically scaling back operations. Within months, it was effectively dormant, a skeleton staff managing the process of winding down an enterprise that had once controlled $2 billion. Democratic politicians who had spent decades cultivating Clinton relationships suddenly discovered urgent scheduling conflicts when asked to appear with her. The invitations to party events stopped coming. The requests for endorsements ceased. The calls from ambitious candidates seeking her blessing grew less frequent, then stopped entirely. Hillary Clinton's famous network, built over 40 years of favors and fundraisers and political IOUs, dissolved almost overnight. The people who had claimed to be her closest allies were unavailable. The politicians who had praised her publicly were silent. The media figures who had defended her for decades moved on to other stories, other subjects, other heroes. The speaking circuit dried up completely. Hillary had commanded hundreds of thousands of dollars per speech after leaving the State Department, her words sought by universities, corporations, advocacy groups eager to bask in her prestige. Within a month of the hearing, every scheduled engagement was quietly canceled. New invitations stopped arriving. The market for Hillary Clinton's wisdom and experience had collapsed entirely. The boards and commissions that had been eager to add Hillary's name to their letterhead quietly removed her. The consulting contracts were terminated. The advisory positions were eliminated. The prestigious appointments evaporated. The elder stateswoman's status she had carefully cultivated since 2016, the vision of herself as a respected voice on foreign policy and a sage advisor to the next generation, disappeared completely. She had become radioactive, a cautionary tale, a symbol of everything voters distrusted about political dynasties and establishment corruption. Her name, once a source of pride for Democrats, became something to avoid, to distance from, to forget. 2 weeks after the hearing, Hillary Clinton released a brief statement through her office. "I am proud of my 40 years of public service and stand by my record. I will continue to advocate for the causes I believe in." But she made no public appearances. She granted no interviews. She had nothing left to say because what could she say? The documents were real. The evidence was real. No amount of spin could change documented reality. Bill Clinton attempted a defense 3 weeks after the hearing, appearing on a Sunday morning talk show. It went poorly, catastrophically so. The host, sensing vulnerability, simply played clips from the hearing and asked for explanations. Bill's famous verbal dexterity, the smooth charm that had carried him through countless scandals, failed him. He sounded defensive, evasive, old. Why did Hillary tell Chelsea it was Al-Qaeda but tell the families it was a video? Bill rambled about the fog of war and evolving intelligence. It sounded like exactly what it was: desperate spin. What about the 33,000 deleted emails? Bill claimed they were personal emails about yoga and Chelsea's wedding. The host pointed out that destroying evidence under subpoena was a crime regardless of content. Bill had no response. "The Uranium One investors gave $145 million to your foundation while the sale was being reviewed. How do you explain that?" Bill grew flustered, insisting there was no quid pro quo, that timing was coincidental. But he couldn't explain why investors in a pending deal would donate such massive sums. He couldn't explain why his speaking fees had doubled during Hillary's tenure at state. The interview was a disaster. Clips of Bill's stammering non-answers went viral alongside the original hearing footage. If anything, his attempted defense made things worse, reminding everyone of his own history of lies and manipulation, his own inability to take responsibility. After that appearance, Bill stopped trying to defend Hillary publicly. The famous Clinton partnership, the 2-for-1 deal that had defined their marriage and political careers, was finished. They had survived scandals before through unity, through attacking their accusers together, through spinning until the media moved on. But this time there was no spin powerful enough. The evidence was too comprehensive. The documentation was too thorough. The lies were too obvious when laid out sequentially, with corresponding documents. The Clintons retreated to Chappaqua. Photographers occasionally captured them on their property or at local events. They looked smaller somehow, diminished. The aura of power that had surrounded them for decades was gone. They looked like what they had always been beneath the image: an aging couple whose time had passed, whose lies had finally caught up with them. Bill played golf. Hillary tended her garden. They saw a few old friends, though visits grew less frequent as months passed. They didn't discuss the hearing. They didn't discuss politics. The television stayed tuned to old movies and cooking shows. The newspapers piled up unread. The phones rang less and less often. The house that had once been a hub of political activity, filled with strategists and donors and rising stars seeking the Clinton blessing, was quiet now, empty. The silence of a mausoleum rather than a home. 1 year after the hearing, a major streaming service released a 4-hour documentary titled The Reckoning: The Rise and Fall of Hillary Clinton. It featured extensive footage from the hearing, interspersed with interviews and historical analysis. Former Clinton staffers spoke openly for the first time, now that there was no career cost to honesty. "We always knew the vulnerabilities were there," one former State Department aide said. "Benghazi, the emails, the foundation. We had responses prepared, but they were deflections, not explanations. We thought if we kept deflecting, people would move on. They always had before." Another staffer was more blunt. "We started believing our own spin. We convinced ourselves every accusation was just politics. We lost the ability to see ourselves clearly." A former senior advisor went further. I loved Hillary. I believed in her. But the Vance hearing forced me to confront things I'd been rationalizing for years. The lies to the Benghazi families, the destroyed emails, the foundation donations from foreign governments. When Vance laid it all out with actual documents, I couldn't rationalize anymore. It was just there, undeniable. The documentary also featured Vance, who reflected on why he had chosen such direct confrontation. "She attacked my family," he said simply. "She mocked my mother's addiction. She called my story a fraud. She looked down on everything I came from with obvious contempt." He paused. "But honestly, that's not why I did it. I did it because someone needed to. For 40 years, the Clintons operated above the rules. Investigations would start and then mysteriously stall. Evidence would disappear. Witnesses would change stories. The media would lose interest. Nothing would ever happen." He gestured to folders on his desk. "I had the documents, I had the platform, I had nothing to lose. She'd already attacked me as hard as she could, so I laid out the record. I let the facts speak for themselves." He shrugged. "The facts were devastating, not because I framed them unfairly, but because they were true." The documentary concluded with footage of the Clinton home in Chappaqua, the camera slowly zooming toward darkened windows. Then it cut to Vance in his office. "Some people believe they're above accountability," Vance said. "They believe if they're powerful enough, connected enough, important enough, the rules don't apply. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they go their whole lives without consequences." He looked directly at camera. "But not always. Sometimes someone stands up. Sometimes someone asks the questions. Sometimes someone presents the evidence. And suddenly all that power, all those connections, none of it matters. Because the truth is on the record and the truth doesn't care how powerful you are." He smiled slightly. "Hillary Clinton learned that lesson 40 years too late, but she learned it. And maybe that's the real legacy. Not that one politician was exposed, but that accountability is still possible. That no one is truly above the law. That truth eventually comes out." The documentary ended with final moments from the hearing. Hillary, ashen-faced, walking out in silence. Vance calmly organizing papers, screen fading to black, text appearing. "Hillary Clinton has made no significant public appearances since the hearing. The Clinton Foundation effectively ceased operations in 2026. J.D. Vance continues to serve as Vice President of the United States." In his private moments, Vance sometimes thought about that day. Not with satisfaction, though there had been some of that, but with wonder at how fragile even the most formidable reputations could be when confronted with documented truth. Hillary Clinton had spent 40 years building an image, the smartest woman in the room, the most experienced candidate, the inevitable president. She had surrounded herself with protectors. She had cultivated media relationships. She had accumulated power and influence until she seemed untouchable, permanent, inevitable. And it had collapsed in 3 hours. Not because of brilliant rhetoric or devious strategy, but because someone had simply presented the documented record. The emails she had written, the donations she had accepted, the women she had attacked, the lies she had told, the evidence she had destroyed. The truth had always been there. It had just needed someone willing to say it out loud. Vance kept one item from that day in his desk drawer. A handwritten note that arrived at his office a week after the hearing. It was from Patricia Smith, mother of Sean Smith, who died in Benghazi. "Dear Mr. Vice President," it read in shaky handwriting. "I watched the hearing. I cried through most of it. For 12 years I've waited for someone to hold her accountable for lying to me about my son's death. For 12 years I've been told to move on, to let it go, to accept that some people are too powerful to face consequences. You showed me that's not true. You showed me my son's death mattered, that the lies told over his coffin mattered. Thank you for not forgetting him. Thank you for speaking truth. God bless you, Patricia Smith." That letter was why he had done it. Not for political victory. Not for viral clips. Not for satisfaction. He had done it because Sean Smith had died and his mother had been lied to. Because Monica Lewinsky had been destroyed by powerful people protecting themselves. Because working-class Americans had been called deplorables by someone seeking their votes. The powerful usually escape consequences. That's simply reality. But sometimes, just sometimes, someone stands up. Someone compiles the evidence. Someone presents the truth without fear. And on that day in that chamber, J.D. Vance had stood up. The truth had done the rest. For the Democratic Party, the hearing marked the definitive end of the Clinton era. For 3 decades, they had been the dominant force, the center around which everything revolved. The fundraising, the strategy, the relationships, everything flowed through them. The hearing shattered that dominance. Donors redirected money. Politicians discovered independent identities. The party began defining itself without reference to Bill and Hillary. We'd been trapped in their orbit so long we forgot there was anywhere else to be, one senior strategist told a reporter off the record. They demanded loyalty but gave us scandal after scandal, loss after loss. They never took responsibility. The hearing was brutal but maybe necessary. Maybe we needed someone to say what we'd been thinking for years. The Clintons weren't good for us. They were good for themselves. For Republicans, the hearing confirmed what they had believed, but could never prove in ways that penetrated the media bubble. The documentation Vance presented wasn't new. It had all been available, but it had never been assembled in one place, presented by a credible figure in a forum that demanded attention. The media protected them for so long, one Republican congressman said. Every scandal was a partisan attack. Every accusation was right-wing conspiracy. But Vance didn't attack. He documented. He let her words, her records, her actions speak for themselves. For ordinary Americans, the hearing became something larger, a symbol of accountability. In an era of widespread cynicism about institutions, the spectacle of a powerful figure being confronted with her own record resonated deeply. I didn't vote for Trump or Vance, one viewer told a reporter in a viral interview. But watching that hearing, I felt hope. Hope that rules apply to everyone. Hope that you can't lie and cover up and destroy evidence forever. Hope that truth still matters. That hope was perhaps the hearing's most lasting legacy. Not political damage to the Clintons, not a boost to Vance's career, but a reminder that accountability remained possible. That someone with courage to document truth and present it fearlessly could pierce even the most carefully constructed defenses. 5 years after the hearing, a journalist tracked down people who had been in the chamber, seeking reflections now that time had passed. Michael, a Democratic staffer who helped prepare Hillary's testimony, agreed to speak anonymously. "We thought we were setting a trap for Vance," he said over coffee. "Hillary was going to lecture him about experience, make him look like a child. We had great lines prepared." He shook his head. "We never considered he might have prepared too, that he might have spent months compiling documentation, that he was letting her attack because every attack gave him an opening to respond. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late." Another staffer was philosophical. "They believed they were untouchable," she said, "and for a long time they were right. Every investigation fizzled, every scandal blew over, every accuser was discredited. They got away with things that would have destroyed anyone else, but that created arrogance. They stopped being careful. They assumed nothing would catch up with them." She paused. "And then one day it did. Vance didn't do anything magical. He just did what a good prosecutor does. Compiled evidence, organized it logically, presented it clearly. The evidence had always been there. Someone finally used it." She turned back. "I think about all the people they hurt over the years, the women Bill assaulted, the staffers who got caught up in scandals, the voters who trusted them and got lied to. None of those people got justice. But maybe the hearing was justice, historical justice. The truth finally got told on the record before the world. In Chappaqua, the Clintons live quietly now. Bill plays golf. Hillary tends her garden. Old friends visit less frequently each year. They don't talk about the hearing. They don't talk about politics. Television stays on old movies. Newspapers pile up unread. Phones ring less often. Sometimes late at night, Hillary walks to her study and looks at photographs on the wall. Her with world leaders, at the State Department, at campaign rallies surrounded by thousands of cheering supporters. A different life, a different Hillary. One who believed she was destined to be president. One who believed rules were for other people. one who believed she would never be held accountable. That Hillary is gone now. The hearing killed her as surely as any bullet. What remains is an elderly woman in a big house, surrounded by memories of power she no longer has and a legacy in ruins. She tells herself she was treated unfairly, that it was all political. That history will vindicate her. But late at night, alone with her thoughts, she knows the truth. The documents were real. The lies were real. The corruption was real. For 40 years she got away with it. And then one day she didn't. Someone compiled the evidence. Someone asked the questions. Someone spoke the truth. And the truth finally set everyone free. The truth set Patricia Smith free from 12 years of gaslighting about her son's death. It set Monica Lewinsky free from decades of being portrayed as villain instead of victim. It set voters free from the fiction that the Clintons were somehow different, that their scandals were manufactured rather than documented reality. And in a strange way, it set Hillary Clinton free too, free from the exhausting performance, free from maintaining an image that required lies upon lies, free from the prison of her own ambition. She can't see that yet, but perhaps someday she'll understand the hearing, devastating as it was also liberation. Because truth, however painful, is always better than lies. And after 40 years of lies, the truth had finally been told. People who watched the hearing would remember where they were, the way previous generations remembered Kennedy's assassination, the towers falling, Obama's election. They would remember Hillary's face when Vance held up the email to Chelsea, the silence when he asked why she lied to the families, her defeated exit, surrounded by staff who could no longer protect her from her own record. And they would remember the lesson, that no one, no matter how powerful, is truly above accountability. That truth matters. That documents don't lie even when politicians do. That sometimes someone stands up and says what needs to be said. And when they do, the world changes. 3 hours. That's all it took. 3 hours to dismantle 40 years of mythology. 3 hours to expose what had been hiding in plain sight. 3 hours to prove that power without integrity is just a house of cards, impressive from a distance but collapsing at the first strong wind. J.D. Vance had been that wind, and Hillary Clinton's house of cards had fallen. The end.